Okay, and so before we get into the lab setup, I want to quickly talk about prerequisites and the available course resources. And so on the prerequisites side, there aren't too many to be honest. This is a beginner-aimed course, but I do have to mention that, in my opinion, cybersecurity itself isn't truly an entry-level field. Or to put that another way, not always a truly beginner-friendly field. And what I mean by that is, there's some knowledge that is often assumed when it comes to basic IT concepts or networking fundamentals. And while it's not impossible to get by without having this, well, having this foundational understanding of these topics will certainly make the learning process smoother and less confusing during certain sections. And so, in terms of some of the areas or concepts that would be beneficial for you to be familiar with, well, we have things like networking fundamentals, like I mentioned, right? And so understanding the TCP/IP or the OSI model. You don't have to be an expert here and know it at a PhD level, and I will say I do break down the protocols here during the network section. But knowing how different systems interact with each other over the network and being able to understand things like what a subnet is, an internal versus external IP address, network address translation, and how routers are used in the network to, route traffic through different networks. And again, I do cover this actually during the network security module, and I cover the main protocols that you're going to want to know as well. But knowing common protocols like SSH or FTP, or the differences between HTTP and HTTPS, that kind of stuff. And then on the endpoint side, well, it would be beneficial to know how to navigate Windows and Linux a little bit, And so you don't have to be an expert in the terminal or in the command line or PowerShell, but even just knowing what they are, basic commands like cd and ls or cat, that kind of thing. Because we're going to be jumping into the command line and the terminal a lot throughout the course. And there's no real way to throw in an Operating Systems 101 section in the course. It's already pretty bloated as it is. But again, I'm always doing my best to explain what commands I'm running, or what arguments or parameters I'm using, and why I'm using them. And so lastly, on the InfoSec side specifically, there's going to be some assumed knowledge on, the foundational security concepts like the CIA triad, or different security controls, and concepts like encryption or hashing. Again, just knowing about these things and why they're used is, more than good enough for me. It's just that, this isn't a Security Plus course, right? And so having that kind of vocabulary coming into this course would be a great head start, but not required. And I'm aware that not everyone will have this background. And so that's partly what the Security Operations Fundamentals section is for. And while I know I do speak a bit fast sometimes, I do try to cover everything as verbose as possible. Sometimes to my own detriment. But just know that I do this to make sure that you're able to follow along, right? And so I try not to just copy and paste commands and run them, unless they're super redundant or not super important. And I try to write out exactly what I'm running, and break down commands by their arguments to give you more of that contextual knowledge. And so now, we should also talk about the system requirements. And so to get the most out of this course, I want you to be able to follow along with the labs as much as possible. And to do that, well, there will be times where we need to run 2 virtual machines simultaneously, and we'll talk more about that in the lab install section. And so we're going to need to install a Windows and a Linux VM. And I'll admit I'm really not a hardware guy. I don't really do hardware, I more so do software. But after basing it on my own lab setup and looking at requirements for similar demands, you're ideally going to want to be running something like a 64-bit Intel i5 or an i7, like a modern host machine with at least 8 gigabytes of RAM and a multi-core processor is recommended to efficiently run multiple VMs. And worst case scenario, if you just don't have the system resources to run 2 VMs simultaneously, or if it's just running too slow for you, feel free to just sit back during some sections and just follow along on a single VM. You can always up the resources for a single VM if you're just using one at a time, but there are always going to be workarounds. On the disk space and storage side, well, you're going to want to have around 80 to 100 gigabytes of free storage space on the hard drive to host the different VMs and install tools and work with the course files. And SSDs or solid-state drives are recommended. You're going to get a lot better performance out of them. But we won't likely get anywhere near filling up the drives. It's more so just a theoretical limit. And we'll be setting up dynamic hard disks as well, and so it's only going to fill up as much as we use them. And again, these are just the recommended specs. And lastly, I just want to point you to the public course repository, which I'll have linked down below. And I'm going to cover this in more detail, along with its contents during the lab setup, But I just wanted to mention that this repository also contains some resources that might be useful to you as you go throughout the course, and also takeaways for you after you finish the course. And so if you go under resources here, and go under bookmarks, for example, well, you'll see this sock_bookmarks.html file. And this is a bookmarks file that you can download by clicking on it, and then clicking on the download icon here. And once it's been downloaded, you can then import it into the web browser of your choice. And so I'll link some documentation below on how to actually import a bookmarks file for a number of different browsers. And when you do that, you're going to have access to a number of different curated resources and links, and a lot of which we cover in the course, and some just for your additional reference or learning. And it's all just meant to be a nice takeaway for you to reference in the field, or just for you to have as you continue on your journey. And so I just wanted to shout out the course repository here. And it might be a good idea to occasionally check up on this in case additional resources are added in the future.